Hi, welcome to session 3 of the first topic of the semester titled The Indigenous Peoples of the Americas in Texas up to 1492. Now, in this session, we're going to continue talking about the agricultural civilizations that are going to flourish, particularly in areas that had a great impact in the development of the Texas region. So we're going to actually start looking at the highly advanced civilizations that flourished in Middle America, otherwise known as Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica and Middle America is the same thing. And that is, again, in a region that today constitutes central Mexico and parts of Central America as well. There will be very advanced civilizations that flourished in Mesoamerica or Middle America that are going to play a key role in the cultural evolution, so to speak, of the peoples that lived particularly in the region that today is West Texas. West Texas, back in the ancient world, the peoples of West Texas, as we will see, were part of a larger cultural region that encompassed what today is West Texas, of course, including New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado. What today is often referred as the American Southwest. That was a cultural region that was very unified, but that was heavily influenced by the peoples of ancient Mexico, the civilizations, the agricultural civilizations of ancient Mexico. And so we're going to start there, as we'll see in just a few moments, looking at the development of particularly two great civilizations that flourished in ancient Mexico and Middle America, and what kind of influence they're going to exert in what today is the American Southwest, the peoples of West Texas. And in this session, we're also going to pay attention to North America, the indigenous peoples of North America that also exerted a cultural influence on the region of Texas. Okay, so at some point we're going to shift gears and look just to North America and looking at the civilizations that flourished in North America and also other groups that were not necessarily agricultural civilizations, but they nonetheless are going to also exert an influence on the peoples of Texas. We're going to look in very general terms at which particular groups and which civilizations flourished in North America that are going to impact this region. And towards the end of today's session, we're going to look particularly just at the region of Texas itself and looking at the specific groups that are going to settle in Texas. We're going to have a greater understanding where they're coming from. Of course, a great many of them are coming from different parts of the continent. Some are coming from the south, like ancient Mexico. Others are coming from the north, the civilizations that we're actually going to mention in this session. And we're going to look at their social conditions, a little bit into their culture and religion, just understanding how those societies lived in very general terms in Texas. Again, we're going to see that. And at the very end, we're going to look at environmental change that affected the Texas region, particularly between the years 1000 AD all the way to the 1400s. In other words, before the arrival of Columbus and later on the Spaniards into the Americas, this region of North America that constitutes what today is Texas, but also the American Southwest, was heavily impacted by a series of climatic and environmental changes that really altered the way people lived, and the relationships between the peoples of Texas, how people related to one another, all of that is going to change as a result of this environmental change. This is something that we're going to see in great detail in this session. So let us now go to our outline. Okay, let us now shift to our outline. So we can continue with our discussion on the agricultural civilizations that are now on the rise as a result, of course, of the different changes that we discussed in session 2. At the end of session 2, we were discussing a series of changes that transpired, roughly speaking, around 3500 BC. Okay, so 3500 BC is going to be an important marker in human history, because all around the world, as I mentioned, we're going to see the rise of what is often referred as the river civilizations. In which people in different parts of the globe began to move towards large bodies of water, particularly river systems, the largest rivers of the earth, in order to divert water from those rivers, build canals or irrigation systems in order to water their crops. And in doing that, they tapped into a reliable source of water that enabled them to produce more food than ever before. Okay, so that really in itself, the building of those irrigation systems, among other things, constituted new knowledge, new techniques that produce a revolution in agriculture. Now human beings are able to produce massive quantities of crops that are going to feed larger and larger populations that are going to live in cities. They're going to create a new social setting. We were talking about that. A new social setting in which people, thousands, tens of thousands of people are going to congregate together in order to build public works, public buildings like religious temples, for example, buildings for administrators. They're going to be building irrigation systems, canals. They're going to be building roads as well for trade and so on. And again, we're going to see the rise of those civilizations. And of course, those civilizations are going to produce systems of knowledge. We were talking about that once human beings are saving grain, because they're generating huge amounts of grain every year, and they're storing their grain, people are going to feel at ease to now devote a significant amount of their time to pursue other endeavors like mental and intellectual development. For example, they're going to start to use their mind to think. They're going to start using their minds to think about the world around them and write down their knowledge. So I was discussing the fact that thousands of years ago, the greatest civilizations of the planet began to develop writing systems, and people are beginning to note down their knowledge, their observations of nature, and this is how we're going to get knowledge from those civilizations that has been passed down from generation to generation to generation all the way to this very present day. All of this knowledge, again, came from the rise of those very advanced civilizations that flourished all over the planet. We were discussing that at the end of session 2. Now, it is at this point that I would like to discuss particularly two highly advanced civilizations that flourished in the American continent, that flourished south of Texas in a region that is today called Mesoamerica. In fact, Mesoamerica was the home of the very first advanced civilizations of the continent, period. In other words, if you want to trace the origins of the very first highly advanced civilizations of America, period, you'll find out again that they flourished in a region that today is present day Mexico and also in Central America. Again, this is Middle America or Mesoamerica. And they were just south of Texas, and because of the proximity, if you will, between Texas and Mesoamerica, there's going to be a significant influence, again, a cultural influence that the peoples of Mesoamerica exerted upon the region of Texas. Again, we can truthfully say that Texas, what today is Texas, by the way, became connected. Once we see the rise of those civilizations, Texas became connected. The region of Texas, again, with Mesoamerica, both in terms of trade. There were, trade networks. There were merchants that were moving from Mexico up north, of course, and also in terms of culture. It's not just the exchange of merchandise that was taking place in the ancient world between the north of Mexico and Mexico City, for example, but also the flow of ideas, cultural ideas, religious ideas, and so on, tools, art, pottery, and so on. Again, that in many cases the merchants that were coming from Mexico up to Texas or in the region of the American Southwest, merchants were actually bringing those ideas up north, if you will. We're going to discuss that in a few moments. Now, let me first introduce the very first highly advanced civilization of Mesoamerica, which is considered to be really the mother culture of Middle America or Mesoamerica, and that civilization are known to us as the Olmecs. Okay, the Olmec civilization. Now, the name Olmec is not necessarily the name that the people that created the civilization used to refer to themselves. Again, this is something that present-day scholars used to refer to the peoples that actually flourished in Middle America very early on, the very early civilization, if you will, of the continent. It is a word that means the rubber people, the people of rubber, because they pretty much discovered rubber, and they use rubber to create balls for sports, if you will. So again, this is just something that scholars use to refer to the civilization. The Olmec began to appear on the scene with their fully developed cities around 1800 BC. It doesn't mean that they suddenly build their cities in that particular century. They have been building their settlements and their cities for many centuries into the past, but by 1800 BC their cities were fully formed, fully developed, and they were very large in scope as well. Okay, they comprised a series of temples, even ball courts for playing sports, for example, and so on, fully developed with systems of knowledge that constituted things like writing and calendars, for example, and art as well. The region in which the Olmecs flourished was a region that today is the Gulf Coast of South Mexico. You can see in this map that the region of red and pink was the region in which the Olmec were building their cities and had an influence in terms of trade, in terms of culture, bringing their culture to other areas during this time, in which again they were flourishing. From 1800, they're going to thrive as a civilization all the way to 250 BC. So they lasted about 1500 years, again 1500 years and thereabouts. Again, that was pretty much the time span of their civilization. So they of course left to us massive monuments that are on display on museums in Tabasco, Mexico, in which they left, for example, among other things, massive stone monuments that depict the face of the rulers, the kings, that once upon a time ruled the Olmec cities. Okay, those are massive structures. They weigh many tons, over 10 tons. Again, those massive stone heads, as they're called. This is something that the rulers ordered the artisans to do, to carve an image of the king, to display that image to the population, and perhaps to be used for ritual worship as well, because if you recall, the monarchs, the Native American monarchs, the kings were considered divine. They were considered to be the incarnation of gods in many cases, okay, like the sun god and so on. Again, so in many cases, those monuments were actually worshipped, again, as divine as well. Okay, and there were about 5 stone heads that have been found by archaeologists, and some of the, of course, features that we can actually see here is something that baffles a lot of scholars, because if you pay close attention to the facial characteristics of those Olmec rulers, one of the things that stand out again is the fact that those facial characteristics resemble the peoples that are commonly, again, at this time occupying the continent of Africa. So again, this is something that has baffled a lot of archaeologists and scholars as to why is it that the rulers of the Olmec sites look like African, perhaps African kings, for example. And again, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of debate as to what kind of connection existed between the peoples of the Americas in the ancient world with the rest of the world. Were there any, perhaps, voyagers, were there explorers that came before Columbus, thousands and thousands of years before Columbus, to the Americas, and once they arrived, the indigenous peoples of Americas actually welcomed them as messenger of the gods, or the gods themselves, and so on. And so because they look different from the peoples of America, perhaps they were elevated to be rulers and so on. Again, there's been a lot of theories about that, as to why is it that the Olmec rulers looked so different, let's say, from the typical indigenous peoples that occupied this region around this time. Again, so it's been a lot of mystery, regarding that issue. And of course, there are, the Olmec cities, like this city. This is a picture taking, from an aerial picture, so to speak, again, from a city that today is called San Lorenzo in present-day Mexico, in the Gulf of Mexico, the state of Tabasco. You can see that the city comprises a series of massive structures like pyramid temples, for example, ball courts and the like, very well organized. There were, of course, mathematicians, engineers that were in charge of building those structures for the purpose of housing the rulers, but also housing the gods that were worshipped by the population as well. Again, those were actually ceremonial centers, by the way. Okay, so the reason why I'm showing you this is because, again, those are the very first cities, period, that are arriving in the American continent, the Olmec cities, that is to say, that we know of. I mean, when we see the rise of civilizations, the Olmecs are the forerunners of civilizations of the Americas, and they're the ones that are building, again, the cities that are going to be, in many cases, copied by other civilizations, if you will, by other groups. Once other groups are starting to build their own civilizations, they're going to build their monuments, their temples, they're going to build their cities, very similar, if not identical, to the way that the Olmecs build their own. Okay. So that's one. That's one civilization. It's very important to know about the Olmecs because it's not just that they were the forerunners of advanced systems of knowledge and city life in the Americas, but around the year 250 BC, the Olmecs are beginning to disappear from sight. Meaning that they're beginning to abandon their cities. There's a massive abandonment, if you will, of the Olmec sites, and there's still a mystery, hasn't been solved. Archaeologists just don't know why. Why is it that the Olmecs abandoned their cities? Where did they go afterwards? It's still a mystery. However, there are some theories that the Olmec did not really disappear. They did abandon their sites, but they took their knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, architecture, art, religion, agriculture, and the like, and they seeded that knowledge in different parts of the continent. Okay, there's a school of thought in archaeology that actually proposes, again, that idea. Just because the cities that began flourishing in different parts of the continent were very similar to the Olmec cities. Again, so again, it's kind of like the logic that some archaeologists use to base that notion, that belief, if you will. So around 250 BC, the Olmec are disappearing, they're abandoning their sites, but at the same time, around 250 BC, there's yet another civilization that is on the rise, almost simultaneously, back to back. As the Olmec are disappearing, there is now a new civilization on the rise in the region that today is central Mexico. Okay, particularly the capital city will be built in what today is Mexico City, just north of Mexico City, that is to say. And that civilization was Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan will be a civilization that flourished around 250 BC and is going to have a lifespan of about 800 years or thereabouts, because by 650 AD, the peoples that built Teotihuacan will also abandon their cities, and a great many of the rulers and the priests that were running those cities began to pretty much disappear from sight as well. Now, again, the significance of the Olmecs and the civilization of Teotihuacan is that they're going to have a great influence, again, on the development of the peoples north of this region, particularly the peoples of West Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado. Again, the reason why I'm actually emphasizing this, because I want you to understand that in the ancient world there was a deep connection between this region of Texas and Mexico, okay, both in terms of trade and also culture, as I mentioned a moment ago. All right, so it is here that I'm actually going to elaborate on that. Okay, so the builders of Teotihuacan were peoples that are today known as the Toltecs. In other words, there's of course some archaeologists that suggest that the actual builders, the forerunners of Teotihuacan, are none other than the Toltecs, and of course the Toltecs are considered to be the founders of ancient Mexico. Okay, the founders of ancient Mexico are considered to be the Toltecs, and they appear on the scene around 250 BC with massive architecture. You know, the massive construction of public buildings and pyramids and temples, roads and canals and so on. Something that starts in what today is Teotihuacan, the ancient city of Teotihuacan, which is about 20 miles north of Mexico City. The city of Teotihuacan. It's a massive city, by the way. Again, it's gigantic. It has massive structures as well. The city of Teotihuacan was named Teotihuacan because, according to legend, this city was actually built by the gods. This is the birthplace of the gods. That's actually what Teotihuacan actually means in Toltec. Okay, in the Toltec language, Teotihuacan means simply the birthplace of the gods. So, it is, again, you know, a legend, a Toltec legend that talks about very advanced peoples, that they were not ordinary human beings, that they were very wise, very brilliant, they were geniuses, but in a supernatural way. That they had a great understanding of the cosmos and the forces of nature. They were magicians and priests who understood the connection between heaven and earth and how to build pyramids in order to tap into the power of the gods, for example. And so they build a city in order to communicate with the gods, you know, to build pyramids that will enable them to see the gods, to have visions, for example, in order to communicate with the higher beings and so on. Okay, that was, again, you know, according to Toltec legends. Okay, so what we see is that Teotihuacan becomes like the capital, so to speak, the hub of the Toltec civilization. And from that region, we're going to see the Toltecs pretty much expanding in different directions. You can see in this map how the Toltecs are beginning to build trade routes and also establish other minor cities. Okay, not as significant as the capital of Teotihuacan, but rather, you know, those were actually cities that were connected to the hub in terms of trade and, of course, in terms of culture. The Toltecs were taking their culture everywhere they went and pretty much creating a massive cultural region in the central valley of Mexico. And this is how the Toltecs are beginning to move up north, by the way, slowly but surely. Over the decades, over the centuries, there will be more and more Toltec merchants moving up north into the region of what is today the American Southwest. This is, again, you know, just a picture of Teotihuacan. That's, again, north of Mexico City, and this is, again, a gigantic city. It's really a marvel of scientific achievement in terms of how is it, for example, that without modern technology, without tractors, without modern equipment and computers and so on, how is it that the ancient Toltecs were able to build such massive structures? Yeah, of course, it took them centuries to build them, but nonetheless, I mean, those are actually pyramids that are aligned with the movement of the sun and the movement of the moon. Those are actually astronomical markers that are very much aligned, again, with celestial bodies. So again, this is something that even today we're still trying to understand. How is it that they build such massive structures? Of course, those are massive. This pyramid that you're seeing here is called the Pyramid of the Sun. It was constructed for sun worship. Again, those are agricultural civilizations that worship the sun for its significance, its vital role in the creation of life. Okay, when the life of agriculture is pretty much regulated by the sun. Every year, the 4 seasons and the like, and the sun provides light, to the development of plants and so on. Again, so those societies will devote a good amount of time and energy to build temples, particularly pyramid temples, to worship the sun, for the sun to continue blessing the fields, to continue blessing the people with more crops, and so on. Again, so this is a massive, massive structure that you can see that the people that are standing there, if you can actually see them, they're so tiny compared to the structure that it's just, incomprehensible. How is it that they were able to build such a massive platform in order to start building the stairways, and of course all the different levels and layers all the way to the top? Again, this is something that still baffles a lot of scientists. Again, is something that is considered also a monument that reveals a connection with the Olmecs as well. So it's not just that the Toltecs were trying to build or building their temples to worship the sun and their gods and so on in order to communicate with them, to tap into their powers, to tap into their energies and so on, but also there is a sign of continuity, that the Toltecs were simply carrying on the knowledge of their forefathers, the Olmecs. It seems that the Olmecs gave the Toltecs this knowledge, and of course the Toltecs pretty much created their own expression of that knowledge of how to build a city, how to build temples, and how to develop systems of knowledge and so on. All of that again is being developed here in central Mexico, and of course that is the civilization that created the country of Mexico. If you want to trace, of course, the indigenous origins of Mexico, you will go back to the Toltecs. And as we'll see now in part 3, as we're going to be looking at the indigenous peoples of North America, the Toltecs will have a direct impact in the development of the cultural expressions, the cultural people of north of Mexico. In other words, many Toltec priests and Toltec merchants are going to take their knowledge up north, and this is going to have a renaissance, a Toltec revival, a Toltec renaissance again north of Mexico, which Texas was influenced by, particularly the west section, if you will, of Texas, by the Toltecs. Now, okay, so part 3, now our attention is going to shift to North America, and we're going to look at different geocultural regions of North America, particularly those that had the greatest influence on the development of the Texas region, particularly. So we're not just going to see all of North America, but rather we're going to see how Texas, or this region of Texas, was connected to a larger geographical and cultural region that encompassed, if you will, more and more land, more and more territories of North America. Okay, so those three geocultural regions that Texas was connected to in the ancient world was what's today is the American Southwest. This is something I've been stressing from time to time. The other region is the Eastern Woodlands. This is a region that is considered to be the region along the Mississippi River, for example, the Ohio Valley, and the Great Lakes region, again the Eastern Woodlands as they were called. Parts of Northeast Texas was connected to that, okay, and also the Great Plains. Okay, in North America there was also a region called the Great Plains that is today considered to be the midsection of the United States. And this region, culturally speaking and geographically, was also connected to north central Texas as well. Okay, so we're going to see what kind of societies lived in the American Southwest that connected West Texas. West Texas was connected to the American Southwest. What kind of groups, what kind of societies, what kind of civilizations flourished in the Eastern Woodlands that had an influence in Northeast Texas, and also the groups that inhabited the Great Plains that are going to also have an impact in North Central Texas as well. Okay, so those are the three cultural regions I'm referring to here. You can see this in this map. So the American Southwest are the regions here in yellow. You can see, if you see what today is the state of Texas, parts of West Texas was connected to a larger geographical and cultural region that encompassed the states of Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. And so West Texas was part of that cultural region. Okay, the Southwest. The Eastern Woodlands is, of course, the region here in green to the east that encompassed all of the groups that lived in this region that created an agricultural revolution and thereby building massive structures, massive cities all across this region. We're going to actually look at some of those cities. And the significance, again, of the Eastern Woodlands is that they're going to migrate and populate parts of East Texas, particularly Northeast Texas, again. So Northeast Texas is going to be influenced very heavily by the Eastern Woodlands peoples. Okay? And the Great Plains, this region here in orange, okay, was very distinct, very, very different geography, different environment, and so on. And so the people that lived here were actually hunters and gatherers, people that were chasing the buffalo, and they also migrated into parts of Texas, particularly north central Texas, and they're going to in many cases colonize, if you will, okay, this region of Texas as well. So this is just giving us a clue as to what are the different groups of North America that migrated into Texas, and thereby how culturally diverse this region was in the past. We cannot lump all the Native American groups of Texas into one category because, as we have seen in this session, the peoples that actually populated or colonized or settled in Texas, they were coming from different places, from different regions that had very distinct cultures, religions, and social organization in very general terms. Okay, so again, this is just giving us a clue of the diversity, if you will, but also the origins of the groups that came into Texas. Okay. All right, so let's start with the very first indigenous peoples of North America that had an influence on the development of Texas groups, Native American groups. And the first one is this region, otherwise known as the American Southwest, that we pointed out. Again, in this map I just showed you, the region in yellow, for example. Again, this was considered to be a single cultural region in the ancient world. Okay, so in the ancient world, there were no political boundaries, of course. People just did not create the kind of boundaries that we're very familiar with today in terms of nations separating from other nations and building boundaries and so on and so forth. Nothing of that sort, nothing of that existed in the ancient world. What actually existed were just territories in which the people that lived there shared a common culture. Okay, a common culture. They shared very similar, if not identical, religious ideas, religious beliefs, religious ceremonies, rituals. For example, they pray to the same gods, the same goddesses. They share similar architecture. For example, the way they build their temples, the way they build their shrines, were very similar, if not identical. Other things is that in many cases they shared similar tools that they use in order to survive, whether there were hunting tools or there was agricultural artifacts or agricultural tools, for example, that they used to farm, to grow crops and the like. Again, those were actually cultural regions. So the American Southwest was actually a region in which there were several groups that, even though they were very distinct and spoke their own distinct languages, nonetheless they shared the same culture. In other words, there was a different cultural elements that pretty much connected them together, if you will, in this region. So the three groups that occupied the American Southwest are going to be the Hohokam, the Mogollon, and the Anasazi. Okay, they lived in different parts of the Southwest. The Mogollon are going to be very significant, as we'll see, in West Texas, because those are actually the peoples that occupied West Texas, parts of what today is the Mexican state of Chihuahua, parts of Arizona as well, and parts of New Mexico, particularly the southern part of New Mexico. The Anasazi occupied the northern part of New Mexico and Colorado, in parts of Arizona, and the Hohokam particularly occupied parts of Arizona as well. Okay, so this is again something that is going to be very, very useful in understanding which particular groups occupied which parts of Texas. You can see that the Mogollon were peoples that occupied not only parts of West Texas, but a great portion of this region of the Rio Grande, the Rio Grande Valley, if you will. Okay, a great portion of the Rio Grande was actually occupied by the Mogollon peoples, of course. Okay, so the people that lived in this region, whether we're talking about West Texas or we're talking about New Mexico, so on, particularly the Mogollon, that actually occupied the Rio Grande, for example, in West Texas, were peoples that adapted to a very unique type of geography and environment. Okay, an environment that was semi-arid. This is not desert, but this is a region that was not tropical either. Okay, it was not tropical. It was semi-desert, if you will, semi-arid, if you will, cactus and so on. This is something that you will find typically on a semi-arid environment. Also, this is a region that has mountains, particularly rocky mountains, rocky soil in many cases, and also a region that has few but very large river systems. For example, the Rio Grande was a very large river system, particularly in this time that we're talking about. Okay, it was abundant with water and so on, and again, and people gravitated towards those rivers in order to tap into this very vital element, not only for survival but also for, in many cases, for farming as well. Okay, and that's exactly how this region is going to develop. This region of West Texas that was connected again to this larger region of the American Southwest. We understand that farming started to take place around 2000 BC. From 2000 BC all the way to 600 AD, we see the development of early farming practices. It took, of course, many centuries, more than 1,000 years actually, for the peoples living in this region to actually start developing farming. And why this region was successful in developing farming was because of the Mesoamerican cultural influence. Okay, the influence of Mesoamerica, whether we talk about the Olmec or we talk about the Toltec, in either case, it was actually Mesoamerica that was responsible for the development of the highly advanced cultural practices such as agriculture, for example, the cultivation of maize. Maize is actually something that today we simply refer to as corn, but the peoples of Mesoamerica, the name that they have used for thousands of years, again, is maize, in other words, or in Spanish, maíz, or maize, in other words. Okay, so maize cultivation or corn agriculture, if you want to be just more practical. Again, this is something that was introduced by the Olmecs and the Toltecs into this region via trading networks. There were merchants bringing pottery, bringing trade, and bringing seeds along with them into this region and teaching the peoples of this region how to actually grow corn, for example, how to actually grow it. So by 100 BC, okay, by 100 BC, we see now the development of permanent farming settlements. That is to say that the techniques, the knowledge that had been practiced for many centuries in terms of trying to grow corn in this region was finally successful in terms of people now building their own permanent settlements, establishing their populations in a single area, and we're going to see population growth again in the American Southwest. They're tapping into the large bodies of water, the different rivers of this area. They're diverting water, and now they're beginning to again build large and larger urban settlements. Okay, now by 650 AD, it is reported that we're going to see an influx, okay, steady migration of Toltecs into the Southwest. Again, this is very well documented. Again, archaeologists have actually detected pottery. They have detected the art, the architecture of the Toltecs in this region that indicates the arrival of Toltec priests, particularly Toltec priests. A great many of them are arriving around 650. This is a very important date because 650 is when the Toltecs are abandoning their cities in central Mexico. Teotihuacan was abandoned, in 650. So what we see is that a great many Toltecs are actually moving up north. this is not the only place that they're actually going into. The Toltecs are also moving south into places like Central America as well. They're moving in different directions. Some of them are moving north, others south. So the ones that move north, they're moving into this region again of West Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Colorado as well. And there's going to be now an influx of peoples coming into this region, bringing with them their specialized knowledge. And the Toltecs are bringing, of course, now the knowledge of building their temples, their pyramids. They're bringing, of course, the knowledge to build waterways, canals, and so on, irrigation systems that are going to lead to the formation of large cities. Okay, and of course, their pottery and the art as well. So this is again something that has to be understood, how Mesoamerica played a key role in the flourishing, if you will, of the Southwest indigenous societies and cultures. Ancient Mexico is having at this point again a direct impact again in the development of the peoples of the Southwest, particularly between 650 all the way to 1100 AD. Particularly in those centuries, there's going to be now a heavy influence of Toltec influence on this region. Okay, and of course this gave rise to the large pueblos. People are beginning to live in pueblos, building their adobe houses. Adobe is a material that is very similar to clay, similar, not identical, of course. And people build their residences, their homes from this material, and in many cases, people build 3-4 story homes in which multiple families live there. Again, not a single family, but again, an extended family. Several families actually are going to live there. So this is another adobe construction. They mirror what today is a building or a multi-story family compound, for example, an apartment, or maybe a hotel, for example. Again, this is again in West Texas, again in this region of the American Southwest. Some societies that were not necessarily building their cities or pueblos, nonetheless, were able to build their houses, in this case, their huts, made from mud. This was also very typical, particularly in the peoples that actually lived in West Texas, again, that they also lived in what is called a mud hut, for example. Okay, this was again something that took them many centuries to learn, but ultimately that became their living arrangements, if you will, their housing arrangements. Now, the other group of North America I want to also elaborate upon here, that is also going to have an impact on the peoples of Texas, particularly Northeast Texas, is the Eastern Woodlands societies, okay, of the Eastern Woodlands. Okay, the Eastern Woodland societies, or the civilization that flourished in this region of North America, in the eastern section of North America, were known as the Mississippians. The Mississippians, this is where we get the name of the river Mississippi, by the way. It comes from a particular group of people that were known as the Mississippians, otherwise known as the Mound Builders. Okay, there's some indication that the word Mississippi actually translates as Mound Builders. Okay, the Mound Builders. Mississippian and Mound Builders are interchangeable terms, according to scholars. Now, again, So this is a civilization that flourished thousands of years before Christ along the Mississippi River, but it extended their presence, their cultural influence, if you will, extended way beyond just the Mississippi River. Of course, it also extended into the peoples that occupied the eastern seaboard of North America as well. What today is, for example, the American South, including, of course, the regions of today, what is New England, including the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes region. It was a vast cultural region, okay, that the Mississippians occupied, okay, and developed for thousands of years. Now, the eastern woodlands are considered to be more cultured, if you will, than other groups of North America, particularly because they flourished in a region that was ripe for agricultural production. So this was an agricultural civilization per excellence. And the kind of conditions I'm actually talking about, again, are conditions that are very favorable for agriculture, like, for example, plenty of rain, plenty of rainfall. The eastern segment of what today is the United States was, again, receiving plenty of rain. There was more vegetation. With rain, there's of course more vegetation. You can grow crops. There's many rivers, not just the Mississippi River, but there's also other rivers that people were tapping into in order to divert water from those rivers to water their own crops as well. Very fertile soil for agricultural production, and of course a warm climate as well. Okay, so again, those were just geographical conditions that were excellent for an agricultural revolution, so to speak. Okay, so the groups that inhabited this region were very successful in creating this agricultural revolution, and with that, they're going to build hundreds of densely populated cities across this area. Hundreds of them. Okay, cities that house tens of thousands of people each. Okay, from 30,000 to 50,000 and more at any given time. Again, this was a very advanced, highly advanced and complex type of society. Okay, very complex. In what way? Well, that in those cities, there were now specialized classes, for example. Okay, so what it means is that there were groups of people that play a specific function in the city, in the organization, in the maintenance, in the functioning of the city, for example. For example, there were, of course, the peasantry. Those were in charge of agriculture. There were also the artisans. Those were creating art. Of course, the engineers, the ones that were actually creating the monuments and the temples and so on. You got also the merchants that were in charge of commerce and trade as well. There was a priestly caste, a caste of priests that were in charge of the religious ceremonies and rituals. There was a warrior class as well, those in charge of warfare, and of course the rulers as well, the rulers. And those groups were ranked in a way that there were people that were at the very bottom of society. In other words, they enjoyed less and less privileges, less status, like the peasantry, for example. Okay, and there were groups that were a little bit better than the peasantry. For example, the artisans. The artisans enjoyed greater privilege than the peasants because they were actually creating art, and art was greatly appreciated during that time. And on top of the artisans, we're going to see other groups such as the merchants. They enjoyed more status, more privileges than the groups on the bottom. And on top of the merchants, we're going to see the warriors, and on top of the warriors, there were the priests, and at the very, very top of the pyramid were the rulers, of those cities. So again, that's again a complex form of society. It's very complex because people are organized into different trades, different specializations, if you will, but they're also ranked, again, from superior to less and less superior, if you will. Again, that's what a hierarchy is. That the groups of society, the different groupings, are actually ranked, if you will, in a way that there are rulers that are actually making all of the decisions for the society, and there are groups that are just below, all the way to the very bottom. Again, there are groups that are pretty much enjoying very little privileges, if you will, at the very bottom. Again, so very complex, highly organized, with laws, with their own religious structures. They have a priesthood. They have public ceremonies, for example. They have laws for trade. They have taxes and that people have to pay, and so on and so forth. Highly organized, again. And as we'll see, a portion of those groups of the Mississippians are going to enter into Northeast Texas. Okay, so they're going to bring this type of culture, the Mississippian culture, and they're going to actually seed it in a certain sense, again, into this region of Texas, the Northeast, particularly the Northeast. That is the significance. So Texas is going to be influenced, again, by different groups. The Southwest peoples that had a heavy Toltec influence coming from central Mexico, they're going to actually influence the development of the peoples of West Texas, but also the Mississippians. Again, thousands of mounds and temples and burial sites built all across this region of the Eastern Woodlands. You can see some of this is a picture. Of course, it's a painting. This is just a painting of how those mounds look like in the ancient world. Those were not actually pyramids made from rocks and stone that the Mississippians built, but rather they turn a mound or a hill or a mountain into a pyramid. So they will carve it. They will actually shape it as a pyramid and use it for religious purposes, to worship their gods and bury their dead inside of those mountains. So again, hundreds of mountains were actually carved into pyramid shapes and turned into temples. Okay, again, this is something that was very, very unique, very distinct about the Mississippians, if you will. The city of Cahokia in the present day, the state of Missouri, housed about 30,000 people. You can see here again that the pyramid that you see on the back is not actually a pyramid. It is indeed, of course, a pyramid, but it's actually made from a mountain. The mountain, again, was turned into a pyramid in that fashion. Okay, the city of Cahokia. Now, the Great Plains, this is another region that is also going to exert an influence into the peoples of Texas. This is, again, a region that encompasses the mid-section of the United States. And this is a region, a geographical region, a cultural region that Texas was part of, particularly when we look at the north central part of Texas. The north central part of Texas was part of another cultural and geographical region to the north, which was considered to be, again, the Great Plains. This is, again, a region that was very different from both the Southwest and the Eastern Woodlands, because in this region, geographically speaking, the environmental conditions are very different. We're not going to see agricultural peoples living there. There will be no agricultural development or agricultural revolution because there was very scarce rainfall in this region. By nature, there's not a lot of rain. It's only 20 inches per year. So you're not going to see people devoting time to grow crops because, again, nature is not providing those elements. Very few river systems. So because agriculture is not going to take place here, what we're going to see is that people are going to simply rely on the hunting of the buffalo. Now they're going to be, of course, hunting buffaloes. This is the home of the buffalo. There were millions of buffalo roaming around from north to south, south to north, according to the seasons. And again, the people that inhabited this region were, for the most part, nomadic societies. Those were hunters and gatherers that depended upon the buffalo, and they were moving along the migrations of the buffalo, year by year by year, if you will. Okay, we're going to see the development, of course, of buffalo hunting practices, along with a buffalo cult, people worshiping the buffalo as their god, and developing a series of dances and religious ceremonies to the buffalo spirit or the buffalo god. Those were actually hunting ceremonies, if you will, and people lived in housing arrangements that were very convenient for nomadic people. Those arrangements that I'm actually referring to are the mobile houses, or teepees. The Great Plain Native Americans lived in teepees because they needed to be on the go, on the move, constantly chasing the buffaloes, so they couldn't build permanent homes. They had to build a home that was very flexible and that could be dismantled very quickly for people to actually take it and in their journey as they were following the herds of the buffalo as well. And again, many of those societies lived in north central Texas, okay, during this time. Okay, we got a little bit of time left. Alright, so now our last part is going to concentrate on the indigenous peoples of Texas. Now, we're really moving into the end of this topic, but just looking now in part 4 at the indigenous peoples of Texas itself. Now that we understand that Texas constituted different regions that were connected to larger regions, both of North America but also Middle America. Now let's look at the indigenous peoples of Texas more closely, and the best way to understand the indigenous peoples of Texas is by looking at the 4 geographical regions of Texas, which gives us the 4 groups, the 4 primary groups or fundamental groups of the indigenous peoples of Texas. This analysis that I just provided a moment ago about looking at North America is going to be very useful in understanding those 4 geographical regions. You can see here in this map, for example, that there's a plains culture, in the north central region of Texas that was connected to the Great Plains. There is in West Texas the Pueblo culture, okay, that was connected to the peoples of the American Southwest that were heavily influenced by the Toltecs, for example. You can see here in yellow the southeastern culture in northeast Texas, and the southeastern culture were, of course, peoples that were newcomers, if you will, in the ancient world from the Mississippians. So again, some of the Mississippian societies actually migrated to northeast Texas, and of course there's going to be yet a 4th region of Texas that constituted the Gulf Coast. That's called the Gulf culture, if you will. Okay, they were totally a separate groups of people that had almost no connection, if you will, to either the Toltecs of Mexico or the Great Plain Indians or the Mississippians. A whole separate group, a whole separate culture is going to develop here in the Gulf Coast as well. So those are the four major cultural regions that gave us the four major groups, if you will, of Texas. So let's talk about number one, the Gulf Coastal Indians. Again, this is the Gulf Coast. As I mentioned, this is again, groups of people that were not directly connected to the Toltecs or the Mississippians or the Great Lakes. The main groups that constituted the Gulf Coastal Indians were the Karankawas and the Coahuiltecans. In this region, those two groups were still living under a kind of hunting and gathering type of living conditions, or their survival strategy depended upon hunting and gathering. Those were nomads that migrated according to the seasons. So during winter time, what they did was that they will go to the coast, because the coastline during winter time was warmer. Even though it would still be cold, it was still had a warmer climate. And so what they did is that during winter time they will actually fish, for example. They will gather some edible plants and the like during the winter time. But as soon as the winter will disappear, they will migrate inland again into places, for example, that today is the Rio Grande River, the San Antonio area, the Austin area, and so on and so forth. Again, they will be migrating. So as soon as the spring and the summer will come, they will come again into this region, and they will be hunting and gathering edible plants. Again, they lived very simple lives, if you will, of the hunter and gatherer. Of course, you can see their housing arrangements that were quite fragile, but again, those were actually very mobile peoples that were moving from place to place. Okay, the Coahuiltecans likewise are peoples that likewise lived in what today is the state of Coahuila in Mexico. The Mexican state of Coahuila is actually named after the Coahuiltecans, because this was a group that actually inhabited this region. The Coahuiltecans were, of course, living along the river, the Rio Grande Valley as well. The Rio Grande River. South Texas, for example, was a region that they occupied as well, and of course the state of Coahuila as well. Seasonal nomadic peoples as well. Okay, their social organization, of course, was based around the small band. Okay, well, those could be very large bands, but a large band will be anywhere between 50 perhaps to 100 people. Those large bands. That's not, of course, a gigantic group. Again, those are actually bands of people, 50 people, 80 people, 100 people. Again, large bands that are moving together along, again, those seasonal migrations. Those bands were considered to be extended family groups. So the members of the band share family bonds, if you will. This is what's called kinship, is that people share familial links, familial connections. They're related to one another, and so on and so forth. And they do, of course, have leaders or chiefs that guide them. Those are not actually positions that are inherited from generation to generation, but rather those are actually people with charisma, with leadership skills, with courage, that is guiding the group in those seasonal migrations as well. Again, very simple organization. I just want you to understand that the Gulf Coastal Indians, again, are hunters and gatherers that are migrating, and they're living in small nested groups that people share familial bonds, if you will. Okay. Then we're going to have the Northeast Texas Indians. As I mentioned, this is a region that had a direct connection with the Mississippians. As a matter of fact, the peoples that inhabited this region, otherwise known as the Caddo Indians, are considered to be actually migrants, Mississippian tribes that entered Texas around the 1200s. So again, those are actually peoples that came from the Mississippi River Valley into Northeast Texas, and once they settled, they became known as the Caddo Indians. The Caddo Indians. They build mounds very similar to the mound builders, the Mississippi mound builders, and they introduce corn agriculture into Northeast Texas. They also will mold, or they will shape a hill or a little mountain into a temple and use it for religious purposes and so on. Those were agrarian villagers. They live in villages, and they subsisted from corn agriculture, particularly something that they had learned, of course, in the past before they came into Texas, as they introduced corn agriculture. That is to say, okay, they had specialization, just like the Mississippians I mentioned, very specialized classes. There's the peasantry, artisans, for example, merchants, warrior caste, priestly caste, and so on, rulers. And their rulers inherit their position from their ancestors. So again, this is a position that is being passed from generation to generation. Hereditary rulers, that is to say. And one of the really striking characteristics here of the Caddo Indians is that they're matrilineal societies. Okay, what is a matrilineal society? Well, a matrilineal society is that women are in control of those societies. Okay, women are the ones that are in charge of the family, they're in charge of the village, and the authority and the entitlements to resources are passed from the mother to others. Okay, so people inherit a home, or they inherit a little garden, or they inherit a certain privileged position, not from the father, but from the mother's side. That is what a matrilineal society is. That is to say, and also, again, those are societies based on kinship, meaning that those villagers also share familial connections. Those are extended families, that is to say, that live close together in those villages as well. Okay. There's also the Southwest Texas Indians as well. I mentioned, again, this is a region deeply connected to the peoples of ancient Mexico, particularly the Toltecs. But in West Texas, we're going to see a group of people, otherwise known as the Jumano Indians. Okay, the Jumano Indians, who were connected with the Pueblo cultures, with the Pueblo peoples from New Mexico. The Jumano Indians are an offshoot, if you will, of the Mogollon. Remember, the Mogollon is a group of people that really inhabited a great portion of the American Southwest along the Rio Grande River, West Texas, Chihuahua, the Mexican state of Chihuahua today, and parts of New Mexico as well. And so the Jumano Indians are part of the Mogollon, if you will, this group of people that lived in this region. Now, the Jumano Indians of Southwest Texas were both peoples that had entered the agricultural stage of development. They were sedentary. They lived in pueblos or in nested communities or villages, but yet other Jumano Indians were still living in the hunting and gathering stage. They were nomadic, that is to say. They were still nomads, surviving from hunting and gathering. They will hunt armadillos, for example, deer, and other animals as well. So again, some groups devoted time for farming, others for hunting. Their religious beliefs and practices, the Humano, of course, were very much related to the kind of practices of the Mogollon that you can find, of course, still descendants of the Mogollon in present-day New Mexico, for example, in Chihuahua. Their religious beliefs and practices center on the worship of spirit entities, particularly the nature spirits, the four elements. For example, when they talk about worshiping the nature spirits, we're talking about the four elements, but also the fertility cult, worshiping the earth mother, the rain, for example. Those are actually practices inherited from the Toltecs. The rain cult, the worshiping the rain god, for example, Tlaloc. Again, this is very, very interesting how the Humanos will worship Tlaloc, which was actually a Toltec god, the rain god as well. Okay, and the spirits of the dead, the spirits of the ancestors as well, are being worshipped by the Humano. And they lived, of course, in multifamily adobe dwellings. In many cases, they're carved from the formations of caves. They live inside of caves, but they shape the cave in a kind of house or apartment. You can see those kind of dwellings, for example, as multiple families live there. Of course, very similar to the peoples of New Mexico as well. In West Texas, the Humanos build also their adobe houses as well, multi-story houses in which multiple families live there as well. Okay, and last but not least, we got, of course, the Plain Indians of Texas. In the Plain Indians of Texas, we're going to see several groups like the Apache, the Comanche, the Wichita, and the Tonkawa, for example, which were actually nomadic tribes of the Great Plains. Those were actually tribes that migrated from the Great Plains up north. Those were actually buffalo hunters, raiders who were very warlike. They competed for resources. They were very skilled in warfare, and in many cases they used their skills of warfare to actually wage war on other groups that in many cases were hunters themselves, but also groups that were villagers, that were agricultural societies. Many of the agricultural societies of Texas were raided, again, by the Apache and Comanche particularly. Again, those were very fierce groups that subsisted from hunting, and they were very skilled in warfare once again. Lived, again, used teepees to travel from place to place and the like. Those were the Plain Indians of Texas. Again, that actually, of course, came into Texas many centuries before the arrival of the Spaniards. Again, those were actually groups that have been moving into Texas and out of Texas according to the seasons, by the way. Now, the last part of this discussion, I want to close it with a phenomenon that really affected the region of Texas, and of course it affected North America as a whole, including Middle America. And that is that this region was deeply affected by environmental change, particularly a change that spanned for many centuries from 900 all the way to 1400 AD. So for centuries, for over 4 centuries or 5 centuries, this region was constantly affected by an environmental change that started out as a cool cycle. Okay, the Earth begins to cool down. As a matter of fact, around the year 900. Again, this is well documented globally. Again, all over the world. Again, the Earth kind of entered a period of cool cycle, if you will, that lasted for about 4 centuries or so. Okay, but it had, of course, consequences and repercussions way beyond 4 centuries, particularly in this region. So when the cold cycle arrived, again, what happens is that this brought massive droughts into this region. Massive droughts. Why? Well, because when things cool down, okay, less water is evaporated. Okay, it's not very hot, of course, things starts to cool down, and less rain, which means, of course, if less water is being evaporated, what translate into less rain, of course. So there's less rain, in other words, because it's colder, the climate, and so on, is getting cooler and so on. So less rain, what happens is that there's less food. There's less food to feed animals, and less food to feed people. So the animal starts to die. So the hunters and gatherers that depend upon hunting realize that there's less animals around, okay, because there's less rain. But also the agricultural societies realize that there's less food to feed people because there's less rain to grow crops as well. Okay, so there's massive droughts, particularly once we get into the 1200s. In this region of Texas and the Southwest, we're going to see massive droughts from 1260 to 1400 AD. That is going to cause dramatic social transformations. This climatic change brought about drastic and dramatic social transformations in this region. Some of those transformations, one is the gradual migration of northern groups to the Rio Grande region. Okay, groups that are coming from North America, particularly hunters and gatherers, are beginning to come into the Rio Grande region in search for water. So they're coming for the water sources, and they want to live near those water sources as close as possible. And they realize there's not a lot of food. Food is very scarce. So what we're going to see is that, number two, a lot of peoples, again, that were nomads, hunters and gatherers, are beginning to invade Texas, and they're going to start getting very aggressive. You know, they're going to raid populations for their resources, for their crops, for example, to steal their food and so on and so forth. Again, this is happening. Again, before the arrival of Columbus, again, Texas is going to be invaded by a number of different nomadic groups, particularly that were very fierce, like the Apaches and Comanches. The Apaches and Comanches were migrating back and forth in and out of Texas in the past, but now, with those massive droughts, they're going to now stay in Texas, and they're going to start now relying on raiding again different communities, different groups, and stealing their resources, if you will. Okay, so again, this is again dramatic social transformation. Number three is that a great many of those nomadic invasions did not stop in Texas. A great many of them actually moved into Mexico. They did not stop in the Rio Grande River. They crossed the Rio Grande River, and they started their journey into the south because they were looking for a warmer climate, for sources of water. They were looking for agricultural peoples that they could actually raid and steal their crops and so on. So Mexico is also going to be invaded as well during this process, during this environmental change. Mexico, of course, is now receiving an influx of invaders, and they're going to be known as the Chichimecas, a word that means barbarians. You know, the invasion of the barbarians into the peoples of Mexico. The Toltecs are going to develop accounts about how the Chichimecas, the northern barbarians, are coming into Mexico to pretty much take over this region, as a matter of fact. And of course, number four, another important transformation is the rise of warfare, is that Texas is going to be plunged again into a state of warfare, because resources are very scarce, rainfall is very scarce, hunting, of course, is not something that is very reliable anymore. So therefore, groups are now in fierce competition with one another for the very limited resources that are available. So this is very important, because what this means is that as Columbus discovers America in 1492, and later on the Spaniards are coming after him. Again, this region is going to be in such a state that the peoples of this region experience climatic change and are still pretty much scrambling for resources, and they're in a state of warfare. And of course, this created a condition of certain groups like the Apaches and Comanches pretty much staying on that mode of raiding and invasion, if you will. And of course, the Spaniards later on, the peoples of Mexico, and of course the United States much later on, are going to have a lot of hard time dealing with the Apaches and Comanches, because those were, groups that were very fierce, very warlike, and were accustomed again to the raid in order to defend territory, to steal resources, and so on and so forth. Okay, so again, with this we close our topic on the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Okay, this is the end of that topic. We conclude. You find, of course, the study questions at the end. There's a series of study questions for you to look at and begin reviewing this material in preparation for the first exam. So why you have those questions is so you can really start organizing your notes and know how to actually respond to each of those questions. If you happen to get this topic in the first exam, you'll be able to actually tackle again those questions and answer them as fully as possible. Okay, so this is all I have for you. This was the very first topic of the semester, the indigenous peoples of the Americas and Texas up to 1492, and then I'll see you then in the next topic coming up. Again, the second topic of the semester, the Spanish colonization of Texas. Thank you.